Hi guys, Niall here and welcome back to the 8020 BIM channel. Today we're going to talk about Revit Scope Boxes, when we should use them, when it's appropriate to assign things to them, and how they are generally created. Revit Scope Boxes have two primary uses. The first is to control the crop region of multiple views. So if you imagine that you might have a stair core going up through a building, and you want to assign various callouts to the extents of the scope box so that if that stair core changes, rather than having to go view by view to the elements that are associated to that stair core, you can merely change them all in one fell swoop via changing the extents of the scope box that they're assigned to. The second one is to actually control the extents and visibility of the datum elements. So if you imagine that you have grids, levels, and reference planes or reference lines, you can tell them to only extend the 3D extents to the bounding box of the scope box that you've created, and then that gives you a greater level of control project-wide for the extents of the datum elements. So what we're going to start with is we're going to go through basically a number of iterations and uses for scope boxes from start to finish. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a scope box. So as you can see on the plan that we have here, I've already created two scope boxes. I've got a scope box A and a scope box B in the higher element here. Okay. But what we're going to do is we're going to create a scope box C down here as well. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go into our view. I'm just going to double click on the sheet here. And under the view tab on the dialog, we go to scope box. Now, there's one thing worth noting about scope boxes is that we can only control the height option variable when placing them in the first instance. So we draw scope boxes in plan and we assign a height to them when drawing them. After the fact, if you want to change the height of the scope box, you're going to have to go to something like an elevation, a section, or a 3D view and use the push-pull arrows to extend or reduce the height of the scope box. So this is the only time we can manually control the exact value of the height of the scope box. So in this instance, we're going to just put in 5,000 and we're going to call this scope box C under the name so we know what we're referring to. And we're just going to draw our extents around this proposed small extension here. So as you can see, we have an overlap with our scope box A here at the corner, okay? So that's how easy it is to create a scope box in the first instance. So next we're going to go and show how we can crop multiple views to this new scope box C. Okay, so as you can see in this drawing here, we have a ground floor plan, a reflected ceiling plan, and two elevations, an east and a south elevation. At the moment, these have no crop region assigned to them. They're just showing everything. But what we want to do is we want to tell these views to basically snap their crop region to stick to our new crop region, our new scope box C that we just created. So we can do this we can do this en masse, which is great actually. We can select our floor plans in the dialog here in the breakdown under the project browser, and we can go on the left hand side and under the extents tab on the properties there's a scope box, so we can assign our scope box to scope box C for our two plans, and straight away you can see that our two plans have cropped down to only show the extents of scope box C. Similarly, we can do this with our elevations. We can either select them here from our project browser or we can select them directly on the sheet that we've placed them on. And we can do the same under scope box. We can say scope box C, and as you can see, our extents have cropped down to the scope box C. Now let's say, for example, this extension was to grow in the east direction by 3 meters. We now have multiple views assigned to this scope box. So rather than individually having to go to every view that we manually control the crop region constraints of, we can merely go back to our main plan. Our main plan, select the extent of our scope box, and I'll just show you this happening in real time. So I'm going to tile the windows down. And as you can see, when I increase the scope box, we actually increase our crop region on the plans that have now been associated to our scope box. So you imagine that this can actually give us very, very quick, accurate control of multiple views at any given time in the Revit environment. This is particularly good when you have something like a stair core going up through multiple levels, and your stair core may have been, let's say in the Irish circumstance, Part K compliant, but suddenly you have a greater number of users of the building than you had initially thought, you may need to make it Part M compliant, and you know that your stair core is going to grow 2 meters in one direction. Rather than changing every plan that has been assigned to each landing and half landing level, you can merely assign a scope box to the stair core, put all your call out views to fit the scope box under your extents dialog, and then control the scope box, and therefore control every view assigned to it. So this can be a very, very powerful tool for large scale drawing manipulation. Another great thing about scope boxes is that we can actually rotate a scope box. So a lot of people, if you look in this instance up here, we have this part of the building, we have our packaging and storage area coming off at an angle, and this is to suit the site constraints that we have. But as you can see, it doesn't follow the same kind of square geometric shape that the rest of the building does, and we can only place scope boxes in a square shape. But on the drawing, that doesn't look correct. As you can see, we have our scope box now assigned to our crop region for this view here is assigned to our scope box B, but it still hasn't rotated correctly, and you can change the rotation on sheet if you want, but not by the exact value that we want. We can only rotate it 90 in either direction. So that's not going to do for our needs. So what we're going to do is I'm just going to close the windows behind us, and I'm just going to open our primary view again and tile the two windows. So the great thing is we know that the angle here is 70 degrees, okay? And our scope box B is drawn at a 90-degree angle. So we can merely rotate our scope box through 20 degrees to make up the difference between the 90-degree and the 70-degree of the building extension. And look what happens in the right view over here when we do this. We put in our 20-degree value, and as you can see, it actually snaps the view to be square. So this is really, really good when you have an instance like this, an extension from a building, or you have an L-shaped building that doesn't exactly follow through a 90-degree footprint. You can very easily assign multiple views to be square to a part of the building without actually having to go and manipulate the rotation of the drawings on the sheet, or try fudge project north versus true north. This is the easiest way of controlling the presentation essentially across the project of elements that are not at a 90-degree angle, but we want to present on the drawings at a 90-degree angle. And similarly, we can just as easy remove our scope box assignment there back to none, and as you can see, we rotate back to our project north or our true north settings depending on what we have. So that's another great use of our scope boxes. After that then, we can actually assign our levels and our grids and our reference planes to the extents of scope boxes. So anyone who's worked in Revit a long time knows that it can be an absolute pain to go view by view and manually change the presentation on the set out of the grids and the levels relative to one another. And we don't want to have to go through that dialogue in this instance. So what we're going to do here is we're going to select all instances of our grids in the entire project, okay? But we're going to not select the three up here that are at an angle. We only want the ones that are through 90 degrees. So we're going to press our shift and we're going to remove them from the selection. Now you can see under the grid properties here, we can actually assign the extents to a scope box. And what that'll do is that'll move the 3D extents of our grid line in 3D space to snap to the end or the extents of our scope box as we drafted it. So we can just select our scope box A, which is assigned for the greater footprint of the original building here. And as you can see, our grids immediately snapped to suit our scope box A. When we select our grid, you can see that we have our 3D point here, and we still have our 2D point, which we can manipulate independently. But this gives you greater amount of control across the whole project for the actual set out and presentation of your grids and your levels. I will quickly do this again in our section views so that you can see. We're going to right click, select all instances in entire project, and we're going to tell them that we want our scope box to be scope box A that's fine. We can disassociate there. So we have our top ones have gone back to the extents of our scope box, but our bottom ones were already assigned to a datum and they haven't changed. So we actually need to disassociate them from the datum if you want to make those changes. But as you can see in 3D space here, we have our 3D extents of their level, which are snapping to the extents of our scope box, and we have our 2D elements that we can manipulate independently. So we're just going to undo that and close out that dialog. So similarly, we want to have these at the angle snap to our scope box B. So we're going to select our 3 grids and we're going to make sure that they are assigned to scope box B. Now, as you can see, there's a greater extent from our 2D elements automatically go out a set amount from our 3D snap point, so we can merely just pull them back in as we see fit per view. Okay. Now, and as you can see in this view here now, we have our 3D extent that is now following the boundary of our scope box B, and we have our 2D extent that we can manipulate independently per view if we need to. Okay. So what's really powerful about this again is that the scope boxes can actually be controlled, can be used to control element visibility. So let's say in this overall view here, we only want to see the datum elements that have been assigned to our scope box A, and that these elements here are not necessarily required at the moment. So imagine that if we went back to our phase 1, we do not want to see the phase 2 grids, and the grids themselves are not phaseable. We only want to see our phase 1 grids in this view. So we can actually select our scope box, and under the views visible, we can press edit. And we can navigate then to our associated views. Okay. And we can override that to be invisible. And once we press OK, we can see that the datum elements that were assigned to the scope box are no longer visible because we've controlled the visibility according to this scope box in that view in particular. Okay, so I'm just going to undo that. That's another benefit of the scope boxes. We can control the datum element visibility in a way that we can't control outside of hiding the elements independently. So that's another tool set to leverage. Another great thing about them is that we can actually assign our reference planes in the same way that we can assign our grids and our levels to the extents of our scope box. So if I type in RP for a reference plane, I can draw our reference planes in whatever way I wish across the project. But then we can select the reference planes themselves, and in the same manner we can assign their extents to match that of the scope box. And as you can see, our 3D extent snap is now on the boundary of the scope box, and we still have our 2D element that we can edit the visibility of. Now, we don't really need to concern ourselves in terms of reference planes and reference lines about the 2D representation, because as a default they are not set as printable. You actually have to tell Revit that you want to see the scope boxes and our reference planes in the printable dialog if you want them printed. There's very few instances though you might want that. Outside of that, in versions more recent than 2019, so from 2019 through to whatever date, we can actually control the visibility of the 3D view by elements within the scope boxes. So we can actually create the 3D view to cut a section that matches the extents of the scope box. So if you imagine under the extents dialog here, now I can't do it here because I'm currently running 2016 at the moment, but under the extents dialog, you can tell the 3D view that you are in to, instead of selecting the selection box and cropping down the view, you can merely just select the scope box option when it's available and tell it which scope box to snap to, and it will cut everything out of the view that isn't within the extents of that scope box. Finally, just from a workflow perspective, it's hugely beneficial to create at least 1 or 2 scope boxes at the start of your project. This will allow you to control the visibility and extents of your grids and your levels and your reference planes throughout the whole project from a very early point in the project, rather than going and creating all your views before you've actually created the extents of your levels and grids, and then having to manually go and manipulate the extents of each of those items per view. So very quickly going to show in this instance, for example, we have 9 grids in total across 2 kind of building volumes. And in this instance, we're likely just going to say, actually, do you know what, this is one volume for the extensive presentation on the drawings. And we're going to go into our view dialog, go to our scope box, and we're going to draw our scope box. First of all, we're going to set our height to 6000 in this instance. If we forgot our height, we'd have to go through a 3D view or an elevation and manually manipulate the push-pull arrow keys when selecting the grid. So we're going to give the extents of our scope box to be just outside the boundary of the building, and yet again we can select all instances of the grids in the project and we can tell them to go to scope box 1. And now you can see we have a much easier way of manipulating and controlling the presentation, of our grids and our levels throughout our project, without going view to view and making sure that they all align. So this is a great way of getting a level of coherence across all the views in terms of the setout and presentation of our grids and our levels. Finally, there is another great use for the scope boxes, and that is that we can actually use propagate extents dialog in our 2D view, in our cut views. If we have multiple views, let's say sections going down along the length of the building, we may have 2D extents that vary from one view from the other, but we want a uniformity across the views. So if we go into our 2 sections here, you can see that I've got 2 views. Now these views are cut sections at different parts of the building. So we've got our section A and we've got our section B here. So it's fair to say that the presentation of our grids and our levels, we want to be consistent throughout. So we're going to look at our grids in this instance. I'm going to change the 2D extents of our grids in this view. Now, as you can see, that I've actually increased them far higher than they were on the lower one. So I can then go into this and select the grids in question. And I can use this propagate extents dialog. And I can basically tell it, Revit will recognize every view that is cut in the same plane with the same grids presented in the same way. So I can essentially just tell it that I want to change the 2D extents of the grid lines, not the 3D, because the 3D is bound by the section box now. Just a 2D presentation of the extents across multiple views. So I've selected in section B now that I want to push the new location of the 2D extents from section A down to section B as well. So we press OK. And as you can see, our grid height, bubble height has increased to match that of our section A. Similarly, we make our change again, and then we go through the process again. So it doesn't remember that you propagated the extents from the first view. You need to do it in each instance that you make the change if you want it to be consistent through the project. Okay. If you imagine that you have something like a structural steel elevation at every grid, you may have 30 or 40 grids running down the length of a building. To have this kind of manual control over the 2D extents so that you have a consistency in presentation without manually having to go and manipulate each of the nodes, it's a huge time saver in the early stages of a project. So, and as you can see, we make the change. So that's a quick overview of how scope boxes work and how we can leverage them to both increase our speed and efficiency of presentation of the data elements, as well as controlling our crop regions per view and assigning a crop region along across multiple views with ease. As I said, if you're retrofitting an internal part of the building that is likely to flex in size, this is a really simple way of controlling the view extents of multiple views that you need to associate to that. Similarly, you have something like a stair core or a lift core that you are not sure of the size requirements. If they're likely to flex across the longevity of the project, then you're better off creating the scope box and assigning all the views to that scope box to give you an ease of manipulation down the line. Thanks for tuning in for this video. If you have any comments or questions, please let me know down below, and I'll do my best to I suppose, give you the answer you're looking for. Like, comment, and subscribe as always. And if you have any ideas for future content, please let me know, and I'll create something on request. Thanks a million, guys. Thanks for checking out the BIM 8020 channel, and I'll see you again. Bye now. Bye bye.